My parents refused to believe my autism diagnosis and threw away my medical reports, saying I was just making excuses. It made them jobless. My parents never believed in autism, even when 3 different doctors diagnosed me at age 24. They said I was using a trendy label to excuse being weird and difficult. My mom said everyone was claiming to be autistic these days to avoid responsibility. My dad said in his generation, people just learned to act normal and didn't need special accommodations. They actually threw away the diagnostic report I'd paid $800 for, saying reading it would just encourage my victim mentality. For 24 years, they'd punished me for things I couldn't control. Meltdowns from sensory overload were called tantrums that needed discipline. Not making eye contact was disrespectful and earned groundings. Stimming by tapping or rocking meant I was acting like a baby for attention. Special interests were obsessions I needed to grow out of. They'd force me into social situations that made me physically sick, then call me dramatic when I'd shut down. They'd scream at me for not understanding sarcasm, then say I was playing dumb. When I finally got diagnosed after years of research and saving money, I thought they'd understand. Instead, they got worse. They said the doctors were scam artists selling fake disorders to millennials. They said I'd been perfectly normal until the internet convinced me otherwise. They actually told family members I was pretending to be autistic because I couldn't handle adult life. They'd invite people over and loudly explain that I was going through a phase where I thought I had autism, but they weren't enabling it. At family dinners, they'd point out every social rule I broke as proof I was choosing to be rude, not unable to understand. When I started wearing noise-canceling headphones in public, they'd rip them off saying I was being antisocial on purpose. When I finally got accommodations at work that let me thrive, they said my employer was too soft and I'd never survive in the real world. They'd constantly compare me to my cousin Tony, who they said was actually disabled because he used a wheelchair, while I was just making excuses. They'd post articles about overdiagnosis and how autism was the new fake trend. They'd comment on my friends' posts about neurodiversity, saying parents needed to stop babying their kids. They'd tell anyone who'd listen that tough love would cure what they called my imaginary autism. Then my dad's company got a new CEO, Mr. Harrison, whose grandson Oliver was autistic. Not that my parents knew this at first, they just knew Mr. Harrison was bringing major changes, and everyone needed to impress him to keep their jobs. My dad spent weeks preparing for the big meeting where department heads would present their teams. He practiced his presentation 100 times, making sure everything was perfect. My mom, who worked in the same company's HR department, was in charge of organizing the welcome dinner for Mr. Harrison's family. The night of the dinner, Mr. Harrison brought his wife and Oliver, who was 16. Oliver wore headphones, carried a tablet for communication, and had a support aide with him. My parents didn't make the connection that Oliver was autistic. They just thought he was rude. My mom loudly complained to her coworker that Mr. Harrison's grandson was wearing headphones at dinner. My dad said the kid was probably spoiled and couldn't put down his electronics. They actually made jokes about Oliver needing an aide to function, saying rich kids were so pampered these days. Mr. Harrison heard everything. During the dinner, Oliver had a meltdown when the restaurant changed the menu without warning. He started rocking and hitting his hands together. My mom whispered to her table mate that if that was her kid, she'd teach him how to behave in public. My dad said loud enough for everyone to hear that some parents just didn't believe in discipline anymore. Mr. Harrison's wife was trying to calm Oliver while my parents continued their commentary about proper parenting and not indulging bad behavior. Mr. Harrison stood up and announced that his grandson was autistic and was having a sensory overload, not a tantrum. He said ignorant comments from people who didn't understand neurodiversity were exactly why he'd implemented new company policies about inclusion and accommodation. He looked directly at my parents when he said the company would no longer tolerate employees who thought neurological differences were character flaws. My mom tried to backtrack, saying she didn't realize Oliver was actually disabled. Mr. Harrison asked what she meant by actually disabled. My dad jumped in, saying they understood real disabilities, but so many people faked things these days. Mr. Harrison asked for examples of fake disabilities. My parents, not knowing when to stop, started talking about me. They told Mr. Harrison about their daughter, who claimed to be autistic, but was just looking for attention. They said I'd been normal until I read about autism online. They actually laughed about throwing away my diagnosis because enabling my delusions wouldn't help anyone. They said they knew better than doctors who just wanted money. They told the CEO of their company that they'd refuse to acknowledge my autism because tough love was better than coddling. Mr. Harrison asked if I'd been professionally diagnosed, and they said yes, multiple times, but doctors would diagnose anyone these days. The room was silent. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Mr. Harrison's face changed in a way that made everyone at the table freeze. His jaw tightened and his eyes went from confused to angry in about 2 seconds. He stared at my parents like he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. The other dinner guests shifted in their seats and suddenly found their phones very interesting. A woman near the end of the table pretended to check a text message. A man across from my dad studied his napkin like it had instructions on it. But everyone was listening. You could tell by how still the room got and how nobody was eating anymore, even though the food was right there. My parents didn't seem to notice they'd just confessed to throwing away medical documents and calling autism fake to the CEO, whose autistic grandson was sitting right there. Mr. Harrison stood up slowly, and the chair legs scraped against the floor. He looked directly at my dad and asked if he was really saying that 3 different professional doctors who diagnosed his daughter were all wrong. My dad laughed, but it sounded nervous and wrong. He said doctors would diagnose anything these days if you paid them enough. He actually said that doctors just wanted money and would tell people whatever they wanted to hear. My mom nodded along and added that young people just wanted labels to excuse bad behavior. She said everyone claimed to have something these days to avoid taking responsibility. Mr. Harrison's voice went cold in a way that made the temperature in the room feel like it dropped 10 degrees. He said his grandson Oliver had those same doctors and went through those same tests. He said dismissing autism as fake was exactly the kind of ignorance his new company policies were designed to get rid of. He told my parents that insulting his grandson's diagnosis while mocking their own daughter showed they had no character. The words hit the table like rocks dropping. My mom's face went pale and she tried to backtrack. She said she didn't mean Oliver wasn't really autistic. She said she just meant that so many people fake it these days, and it's hard to know who's real. Mr. Harrison cut her off mid-sentence. He said there was no difference between calling his grandson's autism real and calling their employee's daughter's autism fake when they both had professional medical diagnoses from actual doctors. He said either autism was real or it wasn't, and they couldn't pick and choose based on who was convenient to believe. My dad opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Mr. Harrison told the entire table that the company's new inclusion policies had 0 tolerance for employees who mocked or dismissed brain differences. He said anyone who thought conditions like autism were character flaws instead of real diagnoses would not be working there much longer. My dad's face went completely white. You could actually watch the color drain out of it as he realized he'd just spent 10 minutes violating his new CEO's core values in front of a room full of witnesses. He'd practiced his presentation for weeks trying to impress this man, and instead he'd told him that autism was fake and doctors were scammers. Mr. Harrison gathered his wife and Oliver and their support aide. He said the dinner was over for his family and they were leaving. Oliver still had his headphones on and was focused on his tablet while his grandmother helped him stand up. They walked out without saying goodbye to anyone. My parents sat frozen in their chairs. The other employees at the table suddenly got very busy with their phones or their food or looking anywhere except at my mom and dad. The woman sitting next to my mom scooted her chair slightly away, like ignorance might be catching. A man who worked in my dad's department stared at his plate. Kira Larson, who worked with my mom in HR, looked absolutely sick. Her face was pale and she kept glancing at my parents, then away, then back again like she couldn't believe what she'd witnessed. The dinner ended fast after that, with people making excuses about getting home or having early meetings tomorrow. My phone rang at 11 that night. I was already in bed trying to read but not really focusing on the words. I saw it was my mom calling and almost didn't answer. But I picked up on the 4th ring. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She said I needed to call Mr. Harrison and explain that they weren't bad people. She said they'd just made a mistake and didn't understand the situation. She kept saying over and over that I needed to fix this. I told her I wasn't calling anyone. I said maybe they should have thought about what could happen before they publicly mocked disabled people at a company dinner with their CEO. My mom started yelling through her tears that I was being selfish and that they could lose their jobs. I said they'd spent 24 years making me feel broken, and now they wanted me to save them from their own choices. I hung up while she was still talking. She called back twice, but I didn't answer. The next morning, my dad called at 7. I was making coffee and jumped when my phone rang because I wasn't expecting it that early. He didn't even say hello. He demanded to know if I'd put Mr. Harrison up to this somehow. He asked if I'd planned the whole thing and contacted the CEO ahead of time. He actually asked if I'd told Mr. Harrison to bring his autistic grandson to the dinner so my parents would say something wrong. I was so tired of their theories that everything was my fault that I just hung up. He called back immediately. I let it go to voicemail. He called 3 more times and I ignored all of them. 2 days later, I got a text from my mom at 6 in the morning. It said HR wanted to meet with both of them about what happened at the dinner. She sent 5 more texts in a row without waiting for me to respond. She was panicking and asking me to write a letter saying they were supportive parents who'd just had a misunderstanding. She said if I wrote a letter explaining that they loved me and just didn't understand autism yet, then maybe HR would go easier on them. She said I could save their careers if I just helped them out this one time. I read all the texts and didn't reply. She texted again an hour later asking if I got her messages, then again at lunch asking why I wasn't answering. I finally texted back that I wasn't writing any letter. I said they made their choices and now they had to deal with what happened next. She called me cruel and said I was punishing them. I turned off my phone. That afternoon, I got an email that made me cry, but in a completely different way. It was from someone named Chloe Wilkinson who said she worked in my dad's department. She said she'd heard what happened at the dinner and wanted me to know she had an autistic nephew. She said if I ever needed someone to talk to who actually understood what it was like, then she was available anytime. She included her personal phone number and email. She said she knew what it felt like when family didn't understand, and that I deserved support. I sat at my kitchen table reading her email over and over. A complete stranger was offering me more understanding than my own parents ever had. I cried because someone I'd never met believed me without question, while the people who raised me thought I was lying. Her kindness felt huge and overwhelming in the best possible way. I saved her contact information and sent back a short email thanking her. My hands shook while I typed it because I wasn't used to people just believing me about being autistic without needing proof or explanations. I replied to Chloe's email the next day, saying I'd appreciate having someone to talk to who understood. We set up a coffee meeting for that weekend at a place near my apartment. When I got there, she was already sitting at a corner table with 2 cups in front of her. She waved me over and smiled in a way that felt genuine, not pitying. We talked for almost 2 hours. She told me about her nephew Christopher, who got diagnosed at 7 after his teachers kept saying he was disruptive. Her sister and brother-in-law spent months learning about autism, reading books, joining support groups, completely changing how they parented. She said it was hard for them to accept at first because they worried about what it meant for his future, but they chose to educate themselves instead of denying reality. She looked right at me when she said that parents who refuse to acknowledge their child's diagnosis are choosing their own comfort over their kids' well-being. She said my parents' reaction was unfortunately common, but completely wrong, and that I deserved better. She validated every single thing I'd been through without me having to prove anything. Then she mentioned something that surprised me. She said Mr. Harrison had been asking HR if there was any way to contact me because he wanted to apologize for what I'd overheard at the dinner. I must have looked confused because she explained that he felt terrible about the whole situation and wanted to offer support. I couldn't believe the CEO of a major company even knew I existed, let alone wanted to reach out to me. Chloe said, Mr. Harrison took neurodiversity personally because of Oliver, and that he'd been pushing for inclusion policies long before he became CEO. She asked if I'd be comfortable with her giving him my email address. I agreed, figuring I had nothing to lose. Within 3 hours of leaving the coffee shop, I had an email from Mr. Ed Harrison in my inbox. He apologized for my parents' behavior and said no one should have their diagnosis dismissed the way they'd dismissed mine. He wrote that he understood how painful family rejection could be, because he'd watched Oliver struggle with relatives who didn't believe autism was real. He offered to connect me with resources if I needed them, and said his door was always open. At the end of the email, he mentioned that the company had an employee resource group for neurodivergent workers and their families. He said I'd be welcome to join, even though I didn't work there, and he included contact information for the group leader, along with the meeting schedule. They met once a month at the company's community center. I read the email 3 times, trying to process that this level of support was coming from a stranger, while my own parents still refused to acknowledge my diagnosis. My mom called 2 days later from a number I didn't recognize. She was crying before I even said hello. She said the other HR employees were treating her differently now, giving her weird looks in the hallway and leaving rooms when she entered. She thought she was going to lose her job. She wanted me to feel sorry for her, to tell her it would be okay. Instead, I said, that's what happens when you publicly mock disabled people. She stopped crying immediately and her voice went sharp. She called me cruel and unsupportive, said I was punishing her for one mistake. I told her it wasn't one mistake. It was 24 years of refusing to see me clearly. She hung up on me. The following Tuesday, I drove to the company's community center for the resource group meeting. 8 people sat in a circle of chairs in a quiet room with soft lighting and noise-dampening panels on the walls. The group leader introduced herself and asked everyone to share their names and connection to neurodivergence. 5 people were autistic adults who worked at the company. 3 were parents or siblings of autistic family members. For the first time in my life, I sat in a room where people just understood without me having to explain or justify everything. Nobody questioned whether autism was real. Nobody suggested I was exaggerating my struggles. Nobody compared me to other disabled people to determine if I was disabled enough. One woman named Millicent talked about her daughter who was 8 and had just been diagnosed. She said her sister Kira worked in HR and had told her about what my parents said at the dinner. Millicent looked directly at me and said she couldn't imagine treating her daughter that way, and several people around the circle nodded in agreement. Another person shared about getting diagnosed at 35 and how their spouse had to completely relearn how to communicate with them. Someone else talked about workplace accommodations that changed their life. The conversation flowed naturally, everyone speaking when they had something to add, nobody forcing eye contact or small talk. I felt something relax in my chest that had been tight for years. 2 weeks after the dinner incident, my parents both received formal write-ups. The investigation had concluded they violated company policy on disability discrimination. My dad called me that evening and he was screaming before I finished saying hello. He said I'd destroyed their lives, that everything was my fault, that I'd always been difficult, and now I'd ruined their careers. I let him yell for maybe 30 seconds before I interrupted him. I told him they destroyed their own lives by being cruel and ignorant. I said they made choices and now they were dealing with what happened next. He started to argue, but I kept talking. I told him I spent 24 years being punished for having a disability I didn't know I had, and they spent those years making me feel broken instead of getting me help. I said if they lost their jobs over refusing to show basic human decency, that was on them, not me. He called me selfish and ungrateful. I hung up and blocked his number. Then I blocked my mom's number too and every other number they'd tried calling me from. I was done being their scapegoat. 3 days passed before my mom showed up at my apartment without warning. I looked through the peephole and saw her standing in the hallway holding a coffee from the place I liked, which felt like a trap. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. She asked if we could talk and said she wanted to understand autism better. I stepped aside to let her enter because part of me still hoped she might actually listen this time. She sat on my couch and started asking questions about sensory issues, but when I explained how certain sounds physically hurt and made my brain feel like it was overloading, she interrupted. She said I never seemed bothered by noise as a kid, and that I'd always been fine at family gatherings. I reminded her about the time I locked myself in the bathroom at her birthday party because the music was too loud, and she'd dragged me out calling me dramatic. She waved her hand, dismissing that memory entirely. I asked her point blank if she remembered all the times I had meltdowns that she called tantrums. She paused for a second, then said those were just me being dramatic and looking for attention. I walked to my bedroom and pulled out the folder where I kept copies of my diagnosis report, the same one they'd thrown away. I brought it back and tried to show her the page listing symptoms and how they matched my childhood behaviors. She wouldn't even look at it. She kept her eyes on her coffee cup and said reading that would just encourage me to use autism as an excuse. I felt something break inside me that hadn't fully broken before. She stood up saying she needed to leave and that I was being difficult on purpose. She said I'd always made everything harder than it needed to be, and that she came here trying to help. I realized she hadn't come to learn anything. She came wanting me to tell her she wasn't a bad parent, to absolve her of 24 years of punishing me for being disabled. I told her to leave and she did, slamming the door behind her. 3 weeks after the dinner incident, I was at work when my phone buzzed with a text from my dad. He'd been demoted from department head to a regular position. The text was vicious, saying I cost him his leadership role and asking if I was happy now. He said I'd destroyed his career over nothing, and that he'd worked for 15 years to get that position. I stared at the message feeling exhausted rather than guilty. I typed back that he destroyed his own career by publicly mocking disabled people. I said he made choices and faced what happened next. He sent 3 more texts calling me selfish and ungrateful. I blocked his number. Then I went through my contacts and blocked every number my parents had tried calling me from, including my mom's work phone and the landline at their house. I was done being their scapegoat. I was done carrying the weight of their consequences like they were somehow my responsibility. Chloe sent me an email that afternoon checking in on me. She said she heard about my dad's demotion, and that the whole department knew it was because of his comments at the dinner. She said people were talking about how he'd been complaining during diversity training instead of actually learning anything. She asked if I wanted to grab coffee after work, and I said yes because I needed to talk to someone who understood. We met at the place near her office, and she told me the company was taking the situation seriously. She said Mr. Harrison had made it clear that disability discrimination wouldn't be tolerated at any level. I thanked her for being supportive when she didn't have to be. She said her nephew deserved people who understood him, and so did I. 2 days later, I got an email from someone named Christopher Chen, who ran the employee resource group. He said they were hosting a weekend workshop about autism and family dynamics led by a psychologist who is autistic herself. He said I'd be welcome to attend even though I didn't work at the company, and that several people had suggested inviting me. I registered immediately. The workshop was held at a community center on Saturday morning. I walked in nervous and found about 15 people sitting in a circle. The psychologist introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Kim and said she'd been diagnosed at 32. She asked everyone to share their connection to autism. 5 people were autistic adults who worked at the company. 3 were parents or siblings of autistic family members. 2 others like me had parents who rejected their diagnoses. One woman said her dad still refused to believe she was autistic, even though she'd been diagnosed 5 years ago. Another person talked about how their mom said they were too smart to be autistic. I felt something loosen in my chest hearing other people describe the exact same experiences. Nobody in that room questioned whether autism was real. Nobody suggested anyone was exaggerating or looking for attention. Nobody compared us to other disabled people to decide if we were disabled enough. Dr. Kim talked about autism acceptance versus autism awareness, and why the difference mattered. She explained that awareness meant acknowledging autism exists, but acceptance meant actually supporting autistic people and listening to what we need. She said parental rejection of diagnosis was especially damaging because it told kids their reality wasn't valid. She explained that parents often rejected diagnosis because they saw it as a reflection on their parenting rather than understanding it as a neurological difference. She said when parents refuse to accept diagnosis, they're protecting their own feelings instead of supporting their child. Everything she said made sense in a way nothing else had. I realized my parents weren't rejecting my autism because they didn't understand it. They were rejecting it because accepting it would mean admitting they'd been wrong about me for 24 years. The next week, I started looking for a therapist who specialized in autism and family trauma. I found Dr. Lisa Moore, who had good reviews and took my insurance. At our first session, she asked about my diagnosis and my parents' reaction. I told her everything from the thrown-away reports to the dinner incident to my mom showing up at my apartment. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something that made me cry. She said my parents' rejection wasn't about me being wrong or broken. It was about their own inability to accept that they'd misunderstood me my entire life. She said that was their failure, not mine. I went to therapy every week after that, and slowly started understanding that I'd spent 24 years trying to be someone I wasn't, because my parents needed me to be normal. I'd twisted myself into shapes that hurt, trying to earn acceptance I was never going to get from them. Dr. Moore suggested I write a letter to my parents that I might never send, just to process my feelings. I spent 2 weeks working on it. I wrote about being 5 years old and having a meltdown at the grocery store because the fluorescent lights hurt my eyes and the noise was too much. I wrote about them dragging me to the car and spanking me for embarrassing them. I wrote about being 12 and getting in trouble for not understanding when my teacher was being sarcastic. I wrote about high school when they forced me to join clubs to be more social, even though being around that many people made me physically sick. I wrote about every accommodation I'd asked for that they called excuses. I wrote about the relief I felt getting diagnosed and finally understanding why everything was harder for me. I wrote about them throwing away that diagnosis like my reality didn't matter. Writing it all out made me realize how much damage their denial had caused. I realized I'd been trying to earn acceptance from people who would never give it, because accepting me meant accepting they'd been wrong. I realized I deserved better than spending my whole life trying to prove I was disabled enough to deserve basic understanding. I decided not to send the letter after all. Writing it had been enough, just getting all those feelings out of my head and onto paper where I could see them clearly. Dr. Moore said that was valid, that sometimes the processing mattered more than the sending. A week after I finished the letter, I got an email from someone named Millicent through the Employee Resource Group contact list. She said she'd heard about my situation from her sister and wanted to invite me to her daughter's birthday party the following Saturday. She explained it was an autism-friendly event with quiet spaces set up, sensory accommodations, and that I shouldn't feel pressured to socialize if I didn't want to. She said her whole family understood autism and treated it like a normal part of life, not something weird or shameful. I almost didn't go because birthday parties had always been overwhelming for me growing up, but something about the way she described it made me curious. I showed up at her house on Saturday afternoon with a small gift I'd picked from the list she'd sent. The party was nothing like the chaotic birthday events I remembered from childhood. There were only 6 kids there instead of 30. The living room had a quiet corner with blankets and pillows where anyone could go if they needed a break. The lights were soft instead of bright. Music played at a reasonable volume. Millicent introduced me to her husband and her daughter, who was turning 8. Her daughter wore headphones and carried a tablet just like Oliver had at that dinner. Nobody treated it like it was strange or made comments about her being rude. When one of the other kids got too loud, Millicent's daughter went to the quiet corner and her dad followed her there. I watched him sit down next to her and help her through the moment without any frustration or impatience. He didn't tell her to toughen up or act normal or stop being dramatic. He just sat with her until she felt better, then asked if she wanted to come back to the party or stay in the quiet space for a while longer. She decided to stay, and he stayed with her, and that was just fine with everyone. Watching them together made something crack open inside my chest. This was what I should have had growing up. This was what childhood could have looked like if my parents had understood instead of punished. I spent the rest of the party trying not to cry while I watched Millicent's family treat autism like it was just part of who her daughter was, not a problem that needed fixing. When I left, Millicent hugged me and said I was welcome anytime, and I believed her. 2 days later, my mom texted me from a new number I didn't recognize. The message said the mandatory diversity training had started, and they were making her and my dad watch videos about autism. She said the training was biased and one-sided, but didn't explain what she meant by that. I stared at the text for a long time, then deleted it without responding. I didn't have the energy to argue with her about whether basic facts about autism counted as bias. Dr. Moore had been helping me understand that I couldn't make my parents learn if they didn't want to, and responding to every text just kept me trapped in the same cycle. The next morning, I got an email from someone named Greg through Chloe. He introduced himself as Kira and Millicent's father, and said he was a senior manager at the company. He said he'd been following the situation since the dinner incident, and wanted me to know that the company's leadership fully supported neurodivergent employees and their families. He said what my parents had said about me was completely unacceptable, and that the company was committed to making sure that kind of discrimination didn't happen again. His email felt genuine in a way my parents' forced apologies never had. He actually seemed to understand why their comments had been so harmful, instead of just being upset about getting caught. Greg sent another email 2 days later saying Mr. Harrison was planning to expand the inclusion policies even further. He said the CEO wanted input from actually autistic people, not just parents or professionals who worked with autistic people. He asked if I'd be willing to participate in a focus group to help shape the new policies. I read the email 3 times trying to figure out if this was real. A major company wanted my perspective on autism policies. They wanted to hear from me, the person my parents said was just making excuses. I emailed back and said yes before I could talk myself out of it. Greg responded within an hour with details about the focus group meeting scheduled for the following week. He said there would be 5 other autistic adults participating, and that Mr. Harrison himself would be there to listen. The day of the focus group, I drove to the company building where my parents worked and signed in at the front desk. Security gave me a visitor badge and directed me to a conference room on the 3rd floor. When I walked in, Mr. Harrison stood up and introduced himself. He was warm and genuine, not at all like the angry CEO I'd heard about from the dinner incident. He thanked me for coming and said he was grateful for my willingness to share my experiences. The other focus group members arrived, and we spent 2 hours talking about what accommodations would have helped us in the school and work. Mr. Harrison listened to everything we said and took notes. He asked thoughtful questions about sensory issues and communication styles and executive function challenges. When I talked about how my parents had punished me for things I couldn't control, he nodded and said he was sorry I'd gone through that. He said every child deserved to be understood and supported, not punished for being neurodivergent. Near the end of the meeting, Mr. Harrison shared that Oliver's diagnosis had been hard for him to accept at first. He said he hadn't understood autism and had worried about what it meant for his grandson's future. But he'd made a choice to learn instead of deny, to research and ask questions and listen to autistic adults. He said that choice had made all the difference in his ability to support Oliver. He looked directly at me when he said that choosing to learn was always better than choosing to reject, no matter how uncomfortable the learning process might be. After the focus group ended, Harrison asked if I'd be willing to stay in touch as the company developed the new policies. He said my perspective had been valuable, and he thought I could help make sure the policies actually worked for neurodivergent employees, instead of just looking good on paper. I agreed, thinking it would be a few more emails or maybe another meeting. 2 weeks later, Greg called me and offered me a consulting contract. The company wanted to hire me part-time to help develop their neurodiversity policies and train managers on autism awareness. The pay was more than I made at my current job, and the work would be remote so I could do it on my own schedule in my own space. I accepted immediately. For the first time in my life, someone was paying me to talk about autism and use my experiences to actually help people. It felt meaningful in a way my regular job never had. I started the consulting work the following Monday and didn't tell my parents about it. I figured they didn't need to know what I was doing with my life since they'd made it clear they didn't respect my choices anyway. But somehow my mom found out 3 weeks into the contract. She called from yet another new number, and I made the mistake of answering because I didn't recognize it. She was absolutely furious. She said she'd heard through company gossip that I was working as an autism consultant and getting paid to talk about my diagnosis. She said I could just be normal if I tried, that I was choosing to make autism my whole identity, that I was taking advantage of the situation for money. I listened to her rant for about 30 seconds before I interrupted her. I told her I was done trying to convince her I was autistic. I said she could either accept me as I was or not be part of my life, but I wasn't going to keep defending my existence to her. She said I was choosing autism over my family. I said no. I was choosing people who respected me over people who didn't. and there was a big difference between those two things. She started crying and saying I was breaking her heart and that she'd given me everything and this was how I repaid her. I told her she'd given me 24 years of punishment for being disabled, and that wasn't something I owed her gratitude for. Then I hung up and blocked the new number. The blocking felt like the right choice at first, but 3 weeks later I was still getting updates about my parents through other people. Chloe messaged me saying my dad's performance improvement plan had ended and it didn't go well. She said HR put him on a final warning, which meant one more mistake, and he was done. She also mentioned he'd been complaining constantly about the sensitivity training, calling it political correctness gone crazy and saying the company was too worried about feelings instead of results. I thanked Chloe for letting me know and felt nothing about it. My dad had chosen to keep digging his hole deeper instead of just learning to treat people with respect. I spent that evening finishing the letter I'd been writing to my parents for weeks. My therapist had suggested it as a way to process everything, but I'd never planned to actually send it. I read through all 6 pages and realized maybe they needed to see it. The letter explained what I'd learned about autism since my diagnosis, how sensory issues actually worked, why I couldn't just try harder to act normal. I wrote about the 24 years of being punished for things I couldn't control and how much damage that had caused. I explained masking and burnout, and why their tough love approach had just made everything worse. At the end, I said I was willing to have a relationship with them, if they were willing to actually try to understand, instead of just dismissing everything. I attached resources about autism, links to articles written by autistic adults, and information about the support groups I'd joined. Then I sent it before I could change my mind. My mom responded 2 days later with an email that made my stomach hurt. She said I was being manipulative and trying to make them feel guilty for being good parents. She said the letter was full of excuses and that I was rewriting history to paint them as villains, when they'd only ever wanted what was best for me. She claimed I was using therapy language to attack them, and that I needed to take responsibility for my own choices instead of blaming my childhood. My dad didn't respond at all, which somehow felt worse than my mom's anger. I read her email 3 times and then closed my laptop. I'd done everything I could. I'd gotten diagnosed, tried to explain, offered resources, extended an invitation to rebuild our relationship. Their choices were their own now, and I couldn't keep carrying the weight of their refusal to understand. The company launched its new neurodiversity initiative the following week with a massive email announcement to all employees. The message outlined new accommodation policies, resources for neurodivergent workers, and mandatory training for all managers on disability inclusion. Mr. Harrison wrote in the announcement that the program had been developed with input from neurodivergent consultants and that the company was committed to creating an environment where everyone could succeed. I read the email sitting at my desk and felt proud of the work I'd contributed. My name wasn't mentioned anywhere, but I knew which policies I'd helped design, which resources I'd recommended, which training materials I'd reviewed. Something I'd built was going to help real people. The messages started coming in that afternoon. 3 different employees from the company reached out to thank me for the new policies. One woman said her teenage son was autistic, and the resources in the announcement were exactly what she'd been looking for. Another person said they'd been quietly struggling with sensory issues at work for years, but never knew they could ask for help. The third message came from a woman who said she'd been masking her autism at work since she was hired 5 years ago, because she was scared of being seen as difficult or incompetent. She said the new policies made her feel safe enough to finally request the accommodations she needed. I responded to each message and felt something shift inside me. This was real impact, not just words on paper. My consulting work started expanding beyond just that one company. Word spread through professional networks, and I got contacted by 2 other businesses asking if I could help them develop autism-friendly policies. One was a tech company trying to recruit neurodivergent employees, but not knowing how to support them. The other was a retail chain that wanted to train managers on working with autistic staff members. I agreed to both projects, and suddenly I had more consulting work than I could handle alongside my regular job. I was building an actual career out of something my parents had called fake. There was a certain satisfaction in that, in proving through success that autism wasn't an excuse or a trend, but a real thing that real people needed real support for. 6 months after the dinner incident, Chloe called me instead of texting. She sounded uncomfortable and said she had news about my dad. He'd been fired that morning for failing to meet the terms of his final warning. She said he'd missed deadlines, made more comments about diversity initiatives being a waste of time, and generally shown he wasn't willing to change his behavior. HR had decided he was a liability and let him go. I thanked Chloe for telling me, and we hung up. 20 minutes later, my mom called from a new number, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. She said it was all my fault, that I'd destroyed my dad's career, that we'd been a happy family until I decided to call myself autistic. I waited for her to finish and then reminded her calmly that my dad got fired for his own behavior and choices. I said he'd chosen to mock disabled people, chosen to ignore training, chosen to keep making discriminatory comments even after being warned. Those were his decisions, and the consequences were his to own. My mom got demoted 3 weeks later. She sent me an email saying leadership had moved her to a lower position in HR because they didn't trust her to handle disability accommodations fairly after everything that happened. She said I'd ruined both their careers and that they would never forgive me. The email was full of blame and anger and zero acknowledgement that maybe their own actions had caused this. I read it twice and then started typing my response. I kept my reply short and direct. I said I didn't ruin anything, that they'd made choices and those choices had consequences. I reminded her that they'd publicly mocked disabled people, including their own daughter, refused mandatory training, and shown they couldn't be trusted to treat neurodivergent employees with basic respect. I told her I was open to rebuilding a relationship when they were ready to actually accept me for who I was, but I wouldn't keep defending my existence to them. I said I hoped someday they'd understand, but until then I needed to protect myself from their constant blame and rejection. Then I sent it and felt lighter than I had in months. Chloe reached out again a few weeks later saying my dad was having trouble finding new work. She'd heard through former colleagues that when potential employers called for references, people were being honest about why he was fired. She said it was harsh, but that companies took disability discrimination seriously now, and nobody wanted to hire someone with that kind of record. I felt bad for about 5 seconds, and then remembered all the times my dad had said I'd never survive in the real world without toughing up. Turns out the real world had standards about treating people with disabilities like human beings, and he was the one who couldn't meet them. I started looking for support groups about a month after everything happened with my parents. I found one that met Tuesday nights at a community center across town, and I drove there feeling like I might throw up the whole way. Walking into that first meeting was scary because I'd spent my whole life being told I was making up my autism, and part of me worried these people would see right through me and say I didn't belong. But the moment I sat down in that circle of folding chairs, and the group leader asked everyone to share their week, I realized nobody was going to question whether I was autistic enough. A woman named Jessica talked about having a meltdown at the grocery store when they rearranged all the aisles. A guy named William shared that his family still introduced him as their son, who has issues instead of their autistic son. Someone else talked about struggling to keep a job because employers said they were too rigid about needing routines. Every single story had pieces of my own life in it, and for the first time ever, I was in a room where people just understood, without needing a medical report as proof. I went back every Tuesday for 3 months before I felt brave enough to share my own story about my parents throwing away my diagnosis. When I finished talking, Jessica reached over and squeezed my hand, and William said his parents did something similar by refusing to tell anyone he was autistic, because they were embarrassed. The group leader, who was autistic herself and worked as an advocate, said family rejection of diagnosis was more common than people realized, and that I wasn't alone in that experience. Jessica and I started getting coffee after meetings, and she told me about her work trying to get the city to add quiet hours at public buildings for sensory-sensitive people. She'd been going to city council meetings alone for months, and getting nowhere because one person asking for accommodations was easy to ignore. I mentioned my consulting work helping companies with neurodiversity policies, and she got this excited look on her face. 2 weeks later, we were standing in front of the city council together, presenting data about how many residents would benefit from autism-friendly public spaces. We asked for quiet hours at the library, sensory-friendly times at the recreation center, and training for city employees about neurodiversity. The council members looked bored at first, but when Jessica shared her story about having to leave the library mid-research, because of a loud event she couldn't handle, and I talked about avoiding city services entirely because they weren't designed for autistic people, a few of them started taking actual notes. They didn't approve everything we asked for, but they agreed to pilot quiet hours at the library and said they'd revisit the other requests in 6 months. Jessica and I left that meeting feeling like we'd actually accomplished something, and we kept going back every month to push for more changes. My consulting work kept growing through that whole time. More companies heard about the neurodiversity program I'd helped develop and wanted similar policies for their workplaces. I was doing consulting work every evening and weekend on top of my regular job, and I was exhausted, but also happier than I'd ever been. My regular job still felt like I was trying to fit into a space that wasn't made for me, even with accommodations. My boss would schedule surprise meetings that threw off my whole day. Coworkers would get annoyed when I asked for written instructions instead of verbal ones, and the open office layout meant I was overstimulated constantly. But my consulting work let me control everything about how I worked. I could schedule meetings in advance, communicate by email, work from my quiet apartment, and structure my day in ways that actually worked for my brain. 6 months after I started the consulting business, I was making almost as much from it as my regular job. 8 months in, I was making more. I gave my 2 weeks' notice on a Thursday morning, and my boss seemed surprised even though I'd been pretty open about how hard the environment was for me. My last day felt like taking off shoes that were 2 sizes too small, and I walked out of that office knowing I was never going back to a workplace that expected me to mask and struggle just to fit in. Working for myself meant I could finally structure my life in ways that made sense for my brain. I worked early mornings when I had the most energy, took breaks when I needed them, and didn't have to pretend to be social during lunch. My business kept growing because companies were starting to realize that neurodiversity wasn't just a nice idea, but actually made their workplaces better for everyone. I was making enough money to live comfortably, and more importantly, I was doing work that actually mattered. Every time I helped a company create better policies, I thought about other autistic people who might have easier lives because of it. I thought about kids who wouldn't grow up being punished for things they couldn't control the way I had been. Then, almost exactly a year after the dinner incident, I got an email from Mr. Harrison's assistant asking if I'd be willing to speak at the company's annual diversity event. The email said, Mr. Harrison thought my story about being diagnosed as an adult and facing family rejection would help other employees who might be struggling with similar experiences. My first reaction was absolute terror because public speaking had always been hard for me, and talking about my parents in front of hundreds of people sounded impossible. But I kept thinking about that woman at my first support group meeting who'd said hearing other people's stories made her feel less alone, and I thought maybe my story could do that for someone else. I emailed back saying yes before I could change my mind, and then I spent the next month writing and rewriting my speech about 50 times. The day of the diversity event, I showed up 2 hours early because being late would have made my anxiety worse. The event was in a hotel conference room with probably 300 people, and I sat backstage feeling like I might pass out while other speakers went before me. When they called my name, I walked out to the podium with my notes shaking in my hands. I'd memorized most of the speech because reading the whole thing would have been too hard, but having the notes there felt safer. I started by talking about what it was like to spend 24 years not understanding why everything felt harder for me than it seemed for other people. I talked about being punished for meltdowns I couldn't control, being called rude for not making eye contact, being told I was acting like a baby when I stimmed. I explained what it felt like to finally get diagnosed and have a name for everything I'd been experiencing, and then I talked about my parents' reaction. I didn't use their names or say they worked at the company, but I described how they threw away my diagnosis, called it fake, and refused to acknowledge that autism was real. I talked about the relief of diagnosis being followed immediately by the pain of family rejection, and how that rejection made me question whether I really was autistic, or just broken the way my parents said. My voice cracked a little when I talked about that part, but I kept going. I explained how I'd found support from people who actually understood, how I'd built a life that worked for my brain, and how I'd learned that my parents' rejection said more about them than it did about me. When I finished, the room was completely quiet for a second, and then people started clapping. Several people were crying, and a woman in the front row was nodding like she understood exactly what I meant. After my speech, at least 20 people came up to talk to me. Some thanked me for sharing my story, some told me about their own experiences with autism or other disabilities, and several people said they'd never really understood what neurodiversity meant until hearing me explain it. One woman waited until everyone else had left, and then told me she'd been wondering if she might be autistic for years, but was too scared to pursue a diagnosis because she didn't know how her family would react. She said hearing my story made her realize she needed to get evaluated regardless of how her family responded, because knowing the truth was more important than keeping everyone comfortable. I gave her the names of the doctors who'd diagnosed me, and some information about the support group, and she thanked me about 5 times before leaving. 3 months later, she emailed me saying she'd gotten diagnosed and it had changed her entire life. She said she finally understood herself and was learning to work with her brain instead of against it, and she thanked me again for giving her the courage to pursue the evaluation. My parents heard about my speaking engagement within days, because apparently everyone at the company was talking about it. Someone had recorded the speech and posted it on the company's internal website, and word got around fast. My mom sent me a text from yet another new number saying she'd watched the video. That was all the text said, just that she'd watched it. No apology, no acknowledgement of what I'd said, no comment about whether she thought I was right or wrong. Just 5 words confirming she'd seen me talk about how much their rejection had hurt me. It was the first time she'd acknowledged my autism without arguing that it was fake, or that I was making excuses, and I didn't know what to do with that. Part of me wanted to respond and ask what she thought, but a bigger part of me knew I needed to protect myself from more disappointment. I didn't answer my mom's text right away because I wasn't sure what I wanted to say, or if I wanted to say anything at all. My therapist and I spent 2 sessions talking about it, and she helped me understand that leaving the door open for possible reconciliation didn't mean I had to actively chase people who'd hurt me. She said I could be open to my parents changing without putting energy into making that change happen, and that protecting my peace was more important than fixing a relationship they'd broken. I decided not to respond to the text, but also not to block the number, which felt like the right middle ground. If my mom wanted to actually talk about what I'd said in my speech, she could reach out with more than 5 words. And if she didn't, then I'd know where things stood. 2 months went by with nothing, and then my mom texted asking if we could meet for coffee and actually talk. The message was longer this time, saying she understood if I didn't want to, but that she'd been doing a lot of thinking and wanted to have a real conversation. I stared at that text for probably an hour trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to say no because I'd been hurt too many times already, but another part remembered how my mom's first text had acknowledged my speech without arguing, and I wondered if maybe something had actually changed. I talked to my therapist about it, talked to Jessica about it, and finally decided I'd meet my mom in a public coffee shop where I could leave if things went badly. I texted back saying I'd meet her but only in a public place, and she agreed immediately. The day we met, I got to the coffee shop 15 minutes early because I needed time to prepare myself. My mom showed up exactly on time carrying a book, and when she sat down I saw it was a book about autism, written by an autistic author. She put the book on the table between us and said she'd been reading it along with some other resources, and that she wanted me to know she was trying to learn. Then she did something I'd never heard her do in my entire life. She apologized. She said she was sorry for not believing my diagnosis, sorry for throwing away my medical reports, sorry for making my childhood harder than it needed to be, and sorry for refusing to understand what I was going through. She said watching my speech and seeing how successful I'd become made her realize she'd been completely wrong about autism being fake or being an excuse. She admitted that the diversity training at work had started changing her perspective, but seeing me speak about my experience was what really made everything click. Then she said something that surprised me even more. She said she'd been scared of my diagnosis because accepting it meant accepting that she'd misunderstood me for my entire childhood, and that fear made her cruel. She said it was easier to call me dramatic and difficult than to admit she'd been wrong about me for 24 years, and she was sorry for choosing her comfort over my well-being. I sat there looking at her across that coffee shop table and told her I appreciated the apology, but rebuilding trust would take time and consistent effort from her. She nodded quickly like she expected me to say that and said she understood completely. Then she asked if she could come to my next support group meeting to learn more about autism, and I just stared at her because that was not what I expected at all. My mom, who threw away my diagnosis and called it fake now, wanted to sit in a room with other autistic people and their families. I told her I'd have to ask the group leader if visitors were allowed, and she said that was fine, she'd wait to hear from me. We finished our coffee and she hugged me before leaving, which felt strange after a year of barely speaking. When I got home, I emailed the support group leader about my mom potentially attending and got a response the same day saying family members were welcome. My next meeting was in 2 weeks, so I texted my mom the date and time, half expecting her to back out, but she confirmed she'd be there. The night of the meeting, I got there early and warned everyone that my mom was coming and explained the whole situation with my parents not believing my diagnosis. 3 people said their own parents went through similar denial phases, so they understood completely. My mom showed up right on time carrying a notebook, and she sat next to me quietly while other people shared their experiences. She didn't say anything the whole meeting, but I saw her taking notes when people talked about sensory issues and communication differences. After the meeting ended, she thanked everyone for letting her attend and asked if she could come to future meetings too. Over the next few weeks, my mom started texting me articles she'd read about autism and asking questions about my own experiences. She wanted to know what things were hardest for me growing up and what I wished she'd done differently. I answered her questions honestly, even though some of it was hard to talk about. She told me my dad still hadn't reached out to either of us and that he was refusing to admit he was wrong about anything. Then she said something that shocked me. She said she'd started divorce proceedings because she realized they'd enabled each other's worst behaviors for years, and she wanted to do better. She said staying married to someone who refused to grow or change would just pull her back into old patterns. I asked if she was divorcing him because of me, and she said no. She was divorcing him because of who she wanted to be going forward. 6 months passed with my mom coming to support group meetings and reading everything she could find about autism. We had coffee every other week and slowly started rebuilding something that felt almost like a real relationship. Then came the holiday dinner with extended family at my aunt's house. I almost didn't go because family gatherings were always hard, but my mom said she'd be there and I decided to try. Everything was fine until my uncle made a comment about how everyone claimed to have something wrong with them these days. My cousin jumped in saying her kid's teacher suggested testing for ADHD, but she wasn't going to label her child. Then my aunt said parents just needed to discipline kids instead of making excuses. I felt my whole body tense up and started planning my exit when my mom spoke up. She told them they were wrong and that neurodiversity was real and dismissing it hurt people. She explained how autism affected daily life using things she'd learned from support group and from me. She said she'd spent years being ignorant like them and it was her biggest regret. The table went quiet, and my uncle tried to argue, but my mom shut him down. She kept going until they stopped making comments, and I just sat there stunned because my mom was actually defending me. I'm building a life now surrounded by people who understand and accept me. My consulting work helps companies create better policies for neurodivergent employees, and I get messages from people saying those changes made their jobs possible. I have friends from support group who get what it's like to be autistic without me having to explain everything. My mom is part of that life now in a healthier way than before, showing up to meetings and actually learning instead of just dismissing everything. My dad still hasn't reached out after more than a year, and honestly, I've stopped waiting for him to. My therapist helped me understand that I don't need his acceptance to know I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be. Some people will never understand, and that's their limitation, not mine. I spent 24 years trying to be someone I wasn't, and now I'm finally just being myself.